Okay. Welcome everyone to the Edith Wheeler Memorial Library. This is the third session of Arthur Gottlieb's James Monroe, A Historical Perspective. I would like to take a moment to thank our co-sponsor for this program, the Monroe Historical Society. And now, without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Arthur Gottlieb.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So picking up where we left off on our program about James Monroe. And one of the things that I like about this era of history is that it's something that never gets talked about that much. It's kind of like the Korean War era in a sense, where it gets lost in between World War II and Vietnam. At this period of time, around the War of 1812, right after the War of 1812, and Monroe is the president who takes office right at the end of that period. Of course, the War of 1812 wasn't over until 1915, 1916, going into 1916. And Monroe is the president who is immediately in a post-war world. The post-war meaning the War of 1812, something that's also widely misunderstood or not known about, sometimes referred to as the Second American Revolution, or the Second War of Independence, I might add. And the era of good feelings, which is what one reporter had mentioned about the Monroe tenure in office, it came from the notion that there wasn't a lot of people beating each other up from two political parties. The party up in New England the Federalists had basically collapsed. And so we imagine how quiet things would be if only one party dominated our politics right now. And so, in other words, there wasn't the other side to be constantly throwing, bear traps for the other. And this would seem like the era of good feelings too, just because you didn't have that that rhetoric and the vitriol being thrown by people who wish the other side was dead. Okay, I'm not overstating that. And it's remarkable for me that looking back into history, American history specifically, like for instance, on Wednesdays this evening, I'm going to be doing a program on focus on contemporary issues. I'm going to be talking about American politics right at this moment. And I'll tell you something, if you changed the names and you changed the faces and you changed what people were the way that they dressed, the same animosity existed right back at this moment in our period of time during President Monroe's tenure. It is, from the standpoint of human nature, it doesn't seem like things change, and for the same reasons. So what do I have for you today? There are three different people that I'm going to be discussing, two of them at length today. One of them probably I'll get to in our next program. James Monroe as president was not somebody who was such a popular figure or such an intelligent figure on his own. He wasn't a brain or a personality like you had so many other politicians be. George Washington was George Washington, Jefferson was Jefferson, Hamilton was Hamilton, and a lot of these people were literally larger than life. Even John Adams, they were all larger than life. James Monroe, not so much. And I'm not taking it away from him or saying that there's something wrong with him because of that. He was, kind of in a sense, the next person in progression. right? And a lot of people resented the fact that he was just another person who became president who was part of this, this Virginia dynasty, as I had mentioned to you before, perhaps even so much as that he was the lesser of all of the previous people from Virginia, okay? It's hard to be in the shadow of a Thomas Jefferson, for instance, or even a George Washington, who was still somebody in recent memory back in these days. So the three people that I'm referring to that had a tremendous effect on the Monroe administration, either in ideological thought or in actual practice, was number one, Thomas Jefferson, right? So it cannot be understated how important Thomas Jefferson was to the formation of this country, even after he was president himself. And that lived through people who were of the same mind and the same ideological way of thinking, as we would call it today, as Thomas Jefferson. I mean, literally, Monroe was somebody who carried on the Jefferson legacy. The second person who was very, very important in making the United States what it is, or what it was, and then what it is, and of course the Monroe administration, was General Andrew Jackson, right? It was General Andrew Jackson, who was already famous by now, because he had conducted a very lopsided victory against the British after technically the War of 1812 was over, and down in New Orleans. And Andrew Jackson becomes one of our most colorful figures in American history, right? I was in the lecture yesterday, and I was telling my audience, this is up in Southbury, and I was saying, yeah, I'm going to be doing a lecture on that's going to include talking about General Andrew Jackson, right? And one of the people in the audience flat out told me that Andrew Jackson was nothing less than a genocidal maniac, right? So so this is pretty. That's not a delicate statement that she had said about General Jackson, and it goes right up to the present day, because General Jackson was what we refer to as a populist. He was really our first real populist, which is a political term we use today, right? So people would say in our current politics, well, you've got Democrats and you've got Republicans, or maybe you have conservatives and you've got progressives, but there's a different creature called a populist. And that means that despite, or whatever their politics are, that the people, for good or bad reasons, love the person. And that's why it's called a populist, you see? And it drives conventional politicians crazy, because the populist may or may not be rooted in or beholden to the normal rising through the ranks of politics, and therefore you did this for me, so now I owe you a favor, and I'm going to be in alignment for you. The populist is different. The populist is driven not by conventional politics, inside the Beltway, as we would call it today. Of course, there was no Beltway then. But the populist is driven and survives on popularity by the people themselves. You see? And so, in other words, the populist always is a wild cannon or a loose cannon in any politics, whether it was all the way back in 1817 or whether it's somebody who's a populist right to this moment. Can you contain them? And the third person, who really doesn't get enough press in my estimation, I always like to go a little bit for the underdog, not because they're underdogs, but because history doesn't speak about it much. They become kind of like underdogs from the fact that they're not written about as much or you don't hear about them as much. And that is John Quincy Adams. Right, John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, right? And John Quincy Adams was Monroe's Secretary of State. And if you want to look at the history of Secretaries of State, sorry, then you would look at John Quincy Adams and argue that this might have been the best damn Secretary of State we ever had. You see, but yet at the same time, you know, nobody ever hears about him that much, right? I recommend to you watch the movie, you probably have already seen this, Amistad, right? And John Quincy Adams actually has a very significant role to play during that whole Amistad story. I'm not going to kill the movie for you, so I want you to go and watch it. It's worthwhile, right? It's got Matthew McConaughey in it and all the rest of that. And but what a statesman! John Quincy Adams shared with his a trait with his father, where he was kind of like this irascible character. You know, I mean, John Adams too. If you've ever seen any dramatic reenactments or read about these things in detail, you know, he wasn't the most popular guy on the block, you know, John Adams. He was a brain, he was principled, you know, but, you know, he wasn't making friends all over the place. And John Quincy Adams actually turned out to be the same way. Except John Quincy Adams had the advantage perhaps of having as his mother the faultless, apparently faultless Abigail Adams. So we'll start off today with Thomas Jefferson again. In the world of Thomas Jefferson, post-revolution, post-constitution, okay? In the early 1800s, or 1805 to 1810, Thomas Jefferson saw the world in a very specific way, right? He saw the world. So what was Thomas Jefferson's vision for the world and the United States of America? Now, the truth is that Thomas Jefferson dealt with the world only as much as he had to. Jefferson still had the point of view about the new world, right? In other words, the North American continent, if you will, specifically, right? And the view was, between George Washington all the way to Thomas Jefferson at least, was that we are as lucky as can be to have crossed the ocean, or ancestors crossed the ocean, and now we're here in this new continent that is going to have the promise of what the political and religious reformation in Europe should have brought about in Europe, but couldn't because it was in Europe. Did that come out right? I hope so. And what that means is that Europe is so laden or with their entrenched politics and their bitter rivalries before, and you have to think, of course, before the European Union, even in our lifetimes, you know, I mean, where, you know, Luxembourg was still Luxembourg and Belgium was still Belgium and France was still France, and, you know, truly unique with their own currencies and their own competition for identity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And our whole history, our legacy, even as Americans, of course, going back to Europe for most of us, is these bitter wars that were fought for forever, right? Forever in Europe. And you know, certainly going back to at least the Romans or before, And as far as George Washington was concerned, I mean, thank God we're not over there and we're over here. I mean, because those people over in Europe are going to be killing each other forever. And why should we stick our head in that meat grinder? You see? And that was really a very important thing to understand. It wasn't just that now we're a country and we're over here and we're one country just like the other countries of the world. No, that is the way we look at things in the latter 20th century up into the 21st century, where the United States is part of a larger global community. I mean, the people back in Monroe's time, when Monroe was president, were going on this Thomas Jefferson legacy, was like, thank goodness we're not Europeans, right? And may I remind you that there was no internet, there was no underwater telegraph cable, no telephone, no radio, none of these things. So we truly were in a different part of the earth and isolated. You see, I mean, we don't have even the advantage of, if you want to call it an advantage, of any kind of perceived isolation. There is no such thing as isolation today, right? Because we have this wonderful device. And this wonderful device there could be somebody on our Zoom meeting right now from anywhere, just like they were sitting here in the same room as us. You see? So whenever we're talking historically, and today we're talking historically, of course, because we're going back to 1817, we have to remember that the kind of connectedness we have today, and the kind of sense that Europe may be Europe, but what's the big deal because it's just a click away. That is not the way it was back in the old days. We were a long way off from Europe with an entire ocean to insulate us from them, and an even bigger ocean to insulate us for whatever was going on between us and the Far East and Russia. But of course, the biggest threat for us was from Europe. You see, we always had this kind of natural progression westward, right? So the point is, with Thomas Jefferson, similarly to George Washington, but more eloquently with Thomas Jefferson, was that we should take this new continent and create the kind of enlightened civilization that was, as I said before, unattainable in Europe. You see, where we have true egalitarianism, right? Now, of course, the truth of the matter is that egalitarianism was referring to white Protestant men, you see. So, I mean, that is, of course, something that's unmistakable from our point of view today, right? Yesterday, I did a program on Susan B. Anthony, and about women's suffrage, et cetera. It'd be very, very interesting to do that sort of a thing, even in a program, perhaps on our format in the future. But women had to wait till, what was it, the 19th Amendment, which wasn't ratified until 1919, and women voted in the first election until 1920. And legally, African Americans were able to vote, I think it was in 1870 something, but of course, notwithstanding Jim Crow laws, women had to wait all those years extra. So Thomas Jefferson, a true Enlightenment person, that is the Reformation in Europe, right? The end of the Dark Ages in Europe, the Enlightenment thinkers, and we were going to create that society here. And we had God on our side, and we were going to do it, and nothing was going to stop us. And we had what was eventually to become known, and this wasn't Thomas Jefferson's term, but we were going to have a manifest destiny, where this land that we were going to create across this nation, all the way to what was to become California, was destined to be ours because our mission was so virtuous that, anything we stepped on in the way was worth the effort. A good case of the means being justified by the ends. See, one philosophical caveat right at that point is that as we looked back at those days, in a century ago, 2 centuries ago, people felt as though they were doing what they had to do out of the absolute best intentions. You see, virtuous intentions. I think what's escaped now in today's thinking, whereas we're comparing ourselves to people of this era, that we see ourselves as different because, well, we don't want to make the mistakes that they're making. But oftentimes our current culture is making similar mistakes because we are equally absolutely sure that what we're doing is so virtuous that the means justify the ends. You see, so I think that every single generation is blind and they're convinced that they're absolutely in the right, and therefore whatever that gets crushed in the process is worth it. And that's really the exact same thing that happened 100 years ago and 200 years ago, with people with just as equal a sense of propriety of them doing the good. And those are the things that we're criticizing today. And if we have people 100 years from now doing some presentation, they may be very well criticizing people of our time for being equally blind. So Thomas Jefferson, he was looking at the old world, and then this is the new world. And the new world we have, even in his day, was you still had a fight over this continent. And the fight was between the Spanish, it was between the British, it was between even the Russians wanted a piece of where now Oregon is, etc. I mean, there were still all of these open claims to the new world as if it were up for grabs. Now, later on, and I'm going to talk about this next time, you have the person who actually puts on notice the entire world during the Monroe administration that the United States is creating official notice that the North American continent is no longer up for being piecemeal grabbed by old world colonial powers, or anybody else for that matter. And that was to be, of course, termed the Monroe Doctrine, you see. And it really, the Monroe Doctrine should be called the Adams Doctrine, John Quincy Adams Doctrine. It was just that it occurred during Monroe's tenure, so therefore it acquires the name Monroe Doctrine. And as I said to you, Monroe himself wasn't really any kind of standout exceptional figure, but what happened during his time as president is notable because of the things that were happening in the world that the people in his administration and working from Monroe were able to achieve, notably Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams, okay, which are my two biggest examples for you today. So Jefferson saw what was going to become the continental United States, long before it was the continental United States, is how do we actually acquire this landmass? So it was always the sense that, yes, we are going to acquire this landmass. Even before it was articulated as such. It was, like I said to you, what was to be termed manifest destiny. All right, so that means that if we're going to go from, I don't know, the Appalachians, and we're going to go all the way to what we're calling the Pacific coast. Well, how do you get that? I mean, what's in the middle of all of that? I mean, you got this vast Spanish territory. Well, that got taken care of when Jefferson actually made a deal with the Spanish. you see? And the French, and we wound up with this massive area in the middle of the country, doubling the size of the United States in one fell swoop in the Louisiana Purchase. And all of this only became possible, by the way, because places like France and Spain, they couldn't afford to, they couldn't garrison the landmass that they had here in North America anymore. You know, they were maybe 100 years earlier when, you know, they can just go around the oceans and stick their flag in the landmass. Maybe they could get away with it then, but now the United States of America was here and we were here. And not only were we an adversary to the original colonial powers that were trying to hold on to their original holdings on this continent, but look at it this way. You know how we're talking about today, and it's kind of like, well, what do we do if, I don't know, China tries to repatriate, that's what they would call it, Taiwan? You know, well, the thing is that Taiwan is like 100 miles from China. China is right there, right? They have a massive geographical advantage. We have to travel, if we're going to go over to the Taiwan Straits with our ships and airplanes or whatever else, I mean, besides the forward bases that you might say we have in, I don't know, Japan or something, and the United States would have to travel like 13,000 miles to get there. You see, and I'm using that example because that's now what it was like for Spain and or England and or France to come all the way over here to the United States. Obviously, it's not 13,000 miles, right? But yet the analogy is the same in the age of sail, to come over here and create a logistical supply chain and everything else like that. And the United States now is an established country. We're right here. So whatever's happening under our nose is going to be a lot easier for us to do than it is for all of these withering colonial powers. I mean, the parallel to our own history is also the parallel to English history. When the British were fighting the French, and when the British were fighting whoever else they were fighting, but specifically the French, after the French Revolution, right, became a Napoleonic state. And then you had the Napoleon, who was it was the best country in the world for land warfare, France under Napoleon. And Great Britain was considered the best country in the world as far as maritime power, you see? Now, the French needed their money too. And they didn't want to spend whatever time that they needed to spend time on or money on here in the North American landmass anymore. It's a very interesting history with as far as the French were concerned, who were more interested in the island of Hispaniola. Right now, of course, Haiti and Santo Domingo, you see? And they were, had colonized that. And that was only useful to them if they had Louisiana. And all of that became a millstone around France's neck. All of these things happened at the same time. The colonial influences of France particularly had a lot to do with the period of time we're talking about, down in New Orleans, etc. Okay? So let me give you an example. I've got my notes here. Starting off with Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, at the end of the War of 1812, as I said to you, had become this terrific, modern, populist hero. He was like the first Elvis, right? Everybody loved Andrew Jackson, right? He took no prisoners. He was a tough guy. He gave no quarter to his enemies, right? Now, once again, this is something that you might say by today's standard is bellicose and toxic masculinity, right? And Andrew Jackson is the kind of a figure where I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Patton, right? And Patton is, I mean, so is Patton, is he our greatest general, right? Because he, you know, if he went through whatever he had to go through to achieve victories, or was he kind of a sociopath? You see? You know, so from the standpoint of 2023, I always have to add kind of like an analysis of what people would think about this in the present day, going back to, you know, what a person might have been perceived as about being very brave or something, you know? And there is no greater example of this than Andrew Jackson, okay? I mean, Andrew Jackson was a painting that that when Donald Trump was president, he had chosen to put Andrew Jackson's portrait up, right? Which I'm sure was probably languishing in the basement before that, because Jackson was kind of, and Patton for that matter, was sort of a, I don't know, at least I got the impression that it was an icon for the former president. And that might say something about what he thought were positive attributes in a person when they're trying to protect their country, which is the euphemism that I'm going to use of what they thought they were trying to do. So Andrew Jackson is already famous, like I said to you, for the Battle of New Orleans. And this is a real David versus Goliath sort of a story, which always makes everybody feel warm and fuzzy if you're on the side of David, right? Right, because the British had amassed this enormous force off of New Orleans, and Andrew Jackson turned out to be a fantastic tactician as far as creating this defensive system that practically annihilated the British and forced them to withdraw. And that is something that is very heralded in traditional American history, you see. I mean, the irony of it, of course, was technically the war, the Treaty of Ghent, which ended the War of 1812, had already been signed. But, you know, it's not like there was a Twitter blast that went out and messaging came up on people's phones announcing it as such, you see. I mean, so he wins this great victory. And like I said to you, he becomes this popular hero in the United States. Now, Andrew Jackson is also responsible for the Indian Wars in the Southern Plains, right? And what we would call the Western United States of that day. You see, so once again, now you've got this whole mopping up thing of Native Americans or indigenous Americans or indigenous peoples, if you will. And, you know, this obviously brings us into very controversial territory from our standpoint now. But even Jefferson, in his quest to have the United States belong to, not that he would have termed it this way, but open to white Europeans, you see, which is de facto what it was. So are the people of this day guilty of the kind of racism that that we would announce that they obviously were today? You know, that's a discussion for a different day. You know that we could spend the rest of our session discussing that. It's an ethical issue, it's a philosophical issue, it's a moral issue, it's all of these things. All right. Thomas Jefferson saw this continent being opened to the inheritors of the American dream as he saw it, right? The benefactor, and they all happened to be white Europeans. And so the Indians were in the way, and Thomas Jefferson and James Monroe essentially was of the same opinion. And all of these people, admittedly, were also slaveholders, you see. So, you know, this period of time has to be looked at through that lens. It has to be looked at through that lens. So in December 26, 1817. Now we're into Monroe's first term as president. There are these skirmishes going on in a different country on the American landmass. And that different country was called Florida. Right? Florida was held by the Spanish. I mean, it was a different country. And so going into Florida from whatever Georgia was invading another country's sovereignty. But in we went under the approval of James Monroe, who sent one Andrew Jackson there. And Andrew Jackson was very happy about James Monroe being elected president, by the way. Okay, because they were simpatico on a number of things, and James Monroe was all too happy to let Andrew Jackson have his way and maybe know exactly what he was doing or not exactly know what he was doing. You see? So there's a little bit here about James Monroe being like, well, I know that Andrew Jackson sent a letter saying that he was going to invade Florida, but I was out sick that day. I didn't see the letter. So there's a little bit of that here. And it was this implied understanding, and then later on actually pretty well clarified, that even pre-facto and post-facto, James Monroe was 100% Andrew Jackson in everything that he did, specifically dealing with native populations, Negroes, and the acquisition of more territory, which was to become the territory of Florida. But Monroe doesn't have his fingerprints on it, right? Andrew Jackson has his fingerprints on it, but James Monroe is the president, you see? So once again, if you want to go straight up to like the present day here and ask yourself in our current politics right now, it's kind of like, so you have the president, you have other things that are going on by cabinet members and departments and all the rest of this, and things happening. And so, how much does the president know? Or if the president doesn't know, should the president know? I mean, after all, isn't he the captain of the ship? So you have all of this sort of a thing that really is completely parallel to what is going on in the Monroe administration, you see? With the only excuse I could give back in these days of 1817, like I said to you, you would say that right now you have instantaneous communication, and obviously in 1817 you did not. All right, so if something was going on, then maybe that took you some time. And also don't forget that in 1817, this is essentially pre-telegraph, it's pre-railroad. I mean, it's different. Things change very rapidly between, say, for instance, Monroe's tenure and the Civil War, right? Because the Civil War, Lincoln was sitting there in the telegraph office, and reports about what was happening in Gettysburg were coming in like virtually in real time, you see? So in a very short span of time, we had gone into literally ancient times of horse and buggy and et cetera, to electronic communication and railroad transportation. And that was something that also happened very, very rapidly between Monroe's tenure and then literally the beginning of the Civil War, which really wasn't that much time. So there was this thing, I wonder if you ever heard of it, it's called the Negro Fort. The Negro Fort, which was on the eastern part of the Florida Panhandle, on close to the Gulf Coast, about, I don't know, I think it's about 60 miles from the border, the northern border of Florida, right? So relatively close to essentially the slaveholding South, you see? So you have the United States and the slaveholding South, and then you've got this other country via the Panhandle, Spanish-held Florida. So there's this place, it's a fort that was built by the British during the War of 1812. which they didn't get to use because they wanted to have a stronghold there, but they didn't really use it. But the British had allies, and the allies were Seminole Indians, and they also had escaped Negro slaves who the British were all too happy to give them sanctuary at their fort, because after all, the British were glad to have everybody who was angry at the continental United States government, right, for allowing slavery. And then as a gift to the slaves, the now freed slaves, when the British withdrew after the War of 1812, they left the fort in the hands of these few hundred Negroes. And say, here you go. Here's the entire fort. And it became referred to as the Negro Fort. Now, the Negro Fort was something that was always a thorn in the side of those in southern Georgia, especially. And Andrew Jackson had his sights on the Negro Fort, you see, because what was happening was that the Seminole Indians and who were based out of the Negro Fort also were launching these skirmishes, right, into the United States, into Georgia. You see, members of the Seminole tribe in Spanish-held Florida were attacking American settlements along the Georgia border in response to United States raids who were going into Florida, right, under the guise of bringing back escaped slaves, which, by the way, was legal to do, right? If you had escaped slaves that came to the north, you had slave hunters, right, who were all too happy to poach these people, bring them back down for a prize. You see, it was the same thing. If you chased people into Florida, then you brought back runaway slaves, you got a prize. You see, so what was happening now was that the Seminoles were attacking settlements along the Georgia border, which then prompted the United States government to launch an official counterattack to suppress what we claimed were these offensive raids against innocent people who were American citizens, you see. So President Monroe orders General Jackson, right, to pursue hostile Indians across the border into Florida. And then what happens is that they eventually go and they target what's called this Negro Fort. And then Andrew Jackson collects his own force of Indians and his own troops, right, including, strangely enough, the Creek Indians, which were one of the tribes that he was partially responsible for driving away. And then Andrew Jackson actually lays siege to the Negro Fort, and they start pumping cannon fire into it. And a hot cannonball lands in the ammunition in the Negro Fort, setting off the entire magazine and blows the Negro Fort literally into orbit, killing everybody inside, men, women, and children. I mean, the entire thing is obliterated because all of the ammunition exploded from this hot shell that landed in a powder keg, you see? And that pretty much took care of the Negro Fort, you see, but that was just the beginning, right? And this is the beginning of what is generally referred to as the First Seminole War, right, which occurs on Monroe's watch. And it is all orchestrated and run by one General Andrew Jackson, you see. So on April 7th to May 28th, 1818, Andrew Jackson, ostensibly under the authority of President Monroe, okay, invades Florida. He just invades Florida, right? So in other words, to protect the United States, we are going to do a preemptive strike into Spanish territory, and we are going to flush out all of these troublemaker Seminole Indians and scrub the area of the rest of these runaway slaves, etc. And it is literally the invasion of Florida. And then this incident occurs because General Jackson captures these two British guys who were really just, I don't know, traders. I don't know what they were trading, what the commodity is in Florida. I doubt if they were beaver pelts, And Jackson announces them as traitors against the United States because it's assumed that they're helping out these people who are enemies of the United States, the Seminole Indians, right? And he has a quick trial on the spot, and he executes both of them. A little frontier justice, you see, but he does it because he has this full backing in his mind of the United States government right up to President Monroe, right? So we've got these two British guys, and Monroe kills them. I mean, not Monroe, Jackson kills them, and that's it. Justice is done. Now, meanwhile, Great Britain, when word gets back to this, Great Britain is ready to declare war on us again, you see? And people over in Great Britain are completely outraged by these cowboys who are obviously in charge of the United States, okay? The Spanish aren't very happy with this either, but the Spanish aren't in a position to do a damn thing, okay? Because the Spanish they're already on the decline internationally, and as far as power and wealth is concerned, you see? The Spanish really don't stand a chance against the burgeoning Americans. And everyone's looking to President Monroe now. The British, the Spanish, the whole world is looking to Monroe. The Congress is looking to President Monroe saying, what are you going to do to rein in this obviously out of control maniac called General Andrew Jackson, right? Because the whole world is on our neck right now, and the whole country is kind of upset. Not the whole country, but Congress, you see? Now, remember that Congress, back in these times, when I started today's presentation, I was telling you how remarkable it seemed to me that the animosities and the alliances and the ability to take any situation that happens circumstantially and turn it into a political weapon to use to destroy the people that you don't like anyway was alive and well right here. Now, the people who wanted to squash Jackson in Congress were the ones who already hated Jackson and wanted to use this as an opportunity to kill Jackson, you see? Monroe, to make a long story short, what does he do about it? Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. President Monroe does absolutely nothing. He doesn't censure Jackson. He doesn't bring him in for court-martial. He doesn't bring him in for congressional hearings. Too bad, right? Because we could watch that on cable TV. And Monroe doesn't do anything for two reasons. Number one, General Jackson is the most popular figure. Everybody loves him. And the average American was kind of like, what? He shot two British guys? Who cares? You see what I mean? So it is like the delicacy isn't there, but kind of like part of the American character reveled in the idea of taking foreigners who are on our continent and killing them and saying, well, they should have known that. Maybe they, next time they'll think twice about getting in our way. You see? So I don't know. You want to pull that part of the American character? The people who actually hated Americans, that is, speaking of people in the new country of the United States of America, even by 1820, was already off the chart. English people, French people, European people were already looking at people in our country as out of control evangelistic freaks. And this was just added right onto it. Now, it was the populism of Andrew Jackson that Monroe looked at and said, well, this guy is so damn popular, I'm not going to rebuke him because I want to be part of that popularity. You see, number one. Number two, Monroe was of the exact same mindset as Andrew Jackson. The thing is with Monroe is he doesn't write a book about it saying, I'm glad that Andrew Jackson shot those guys, you see? Or I'm glad that Andrew Jackson, lobbed a shell into the Negro fort and blew those people straight to atoms. All right, Monroe never comes out and says any of those things, you see, but it is, from everything that I've read at least, he is completely in sympathy with it. You see, but all of it is laid on Andrew Jackson. And, there you have it. That's the invasion of Florida and the Negro fort. Later on, of course, we're going to talk about, I'll talk about next time when I talk about John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams actually negotiates for the rest of Florida, to be handed over. The kind of wheeling and dealing that's going on here with our diplomats from the United States of America going over into France and Spain, et cetera. The old world countries were hard pressed. If you want to think about the kind of bankruptcy that countries were in, I'm not going to say that Spain was bankrupt, but Spain and Portugal didn't have the money or the wherewithal by 1820 to maintain literally a war against a burgeoning United States of America. It just wasn't worth it. They had to find a way to get out gracefully, you see. And that's the situation. In the United States, saw that. The United States of America, during the period of time I'm talking about, think of it this way, and I'll bring you this example only because I'm a counselor and that it reminds me of this particular parallel, right? If you see situations where you've got, I don't know, a parent, and then you've got a young person who is, I don't know, an adolescent, a teenager, and the teenager is sensing that they're on the ascendancy as far as power is concerned in the power relationship between they and their parents and they and against all authority figures, because they are going to have more and more power just by the nature of the fact that they're now 16 years old, 17-year-olds, 18 years old, 19, 20, 21. And simultaneously, their parent, who might be in their 40s or the 50s, maybe younger, they are kind of like on a decline, right? It is an inverted sense of, once I instinctively know that I'm getting stronger, and even if you still have control over me administratively, it's going to be very, very soon where you're not going to have any control over me. And I already know that. And you already know you're in decline. You see the parallel I just made here? And that is what the United States was during this period of time. We were the young adolescent who knew they were going to get stronger and stronger and stronger. And we were looking at the old authoritarian, nations, the old nation states of the original and secondary age of exploration, and basically saying, not only can you not control us, we're going to throw you the hell out of here. That's what this was. That is exactly what this era was. You see, it was like this amazing, I don't want to call it a sweet spot, but I don't know what else to call it. All right, it is the War of 1812 is over. We have effectively neutralized the Spanish. You see, we don't have to worry about the British anymore, right? The French are ready to make this massive deal with us. We don't have to worry about them either, you see. And this thing about slavery in our own country, yeah, everybody knows it's an issue, but it's not an issue right now. You see? So we weren't embroiled in our own domestic fight about should we be a slave nation or a free nation, right? So we weren't embroiled in that yet we were free of finally the European encroachment on our continent. It was like this one sweet spot where we were like free to go west, whoever was in front of us, including of course, it was Spanish Mexico, all right? And we didn't have to worry about it. We had complete confidence. You see, but it was right before we were in between two bookends. One bookend is that the nations from our parents' generation were still had a hold on us, and now they don't anymore. We're free. We're free. We're kids at college, right? And right, the signs were there where we were just about to get embroiled in this massive internal conflict that was going to consume us, which was, what are we going to do about slavery in our own country? But it hadn't gelled yet. You see, it was this one sweet spot, right? It's another reason why the Monroe administration, this particular 2 terms of service, was called the era of good feelings. January 13th, 1820. Excuse me. This is not beer, by the way, it's tea. The merchant ship, see if I can read my notes. The merchant ship Elizabeth, chartered by the American Colonization Society. How's that for a name of something, right? Do you imagine that seeing on the bumper sticker on a car now? You're behind the car in the merit. It's this proud member of the American Colonization Society, right? The merchant ship Elizabeth, chartered by the American Colonization Society, leaves New York for West Africa in order to establish a colony of free African Americans. One of the founders of the American Colonization Society was our James Monroe. He advocated sending Black Africans to Africa ever since his tenure as Virginia's governor. As President Monroe, he convinced Congress to appropriate $100,000. That's $100,000 in 1820. Okay, $100,000 for the mission, and offers the American Colonization Society additional federal aid to go and acquire territory in Africa for this purpose. When the colony of Liberia is founded, the capital is named Monrovia in Monroe's honor. Well, that's fascinating, isn't it? You know, and I was wondering to myself when I was putting this together, I was saying, I wonder what became of Monrovia, right? Or what became of Liberia. So I just did a quick internet search, and this isn't like scientific document. I literally Wikipedia'd it, and I know that those things, it's not exactly scholarship, okay? But I just wanted to share this with you. And so this is Wikipedia, and this is today, and the title is Liberia. And the first thing that struck out to me is it's got a flag on it, and the flag of Liberia is, I don't know, does that look like the American flag to you? You see, except it's got one star in the middle of the blue field. And that's no accident. Blah, 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 population, where it is, blah, blah, blah. Liberia began in the early 19th century. And as a project of the American Colonization Society, which believed Black people would face better chances for freedom and prosperity in Africa than in the United States. So between 1822, right, so this is during Monroe's presidency, and the outbreak of the American Civil War in 1861, more than 15,000 freed and freeborn African Americans, along with 3,198 Afro-Caribbeans, relocated to Liberia. Did you know that? I didn't know that. I mean, I never bothered looking at it until I was doing this. Gradually developing an Americo-Liberian identity, the settlers carried their culture and tradition with them. Liberia declared independence on July 26, 1847, which the United States did not recognize until February 2nd, 1862. You know, when it goes on, it's actually kind of interesting. Liberia supported the United States war effort against Germany in World War II, and in return received considerable American investment in infrastructure, which aided the country's wealth and development. Right? Isn't that fascinating? So there you go. You know, and if you want to read the rest of it, it's just, I mean, like I said, it was just a Wikipedia search. So there was a lot of people who felt the same way Monroe did. They were kind of like, all right, well, I mean, look at the position here. It's all right. We don't want you to be slaves anymore. But why don't you go back to Africa? Right? Here's a boat. Here's a ticket, and you know, knock yourself out. You know, so I mean, of course, from the lens of today and the lens of, you know, social justice, this seems like an abomination, you know, but probably, and I don't know because I wasn't there, so hence the probably, back in Monroe's time, this seemed like a perfectly reasonable solution. You know, I don't think there were a lot of people who, like, maybe you didn't want to be an African person to be a slave, but I don't know, you didn't want them dating your daughter either. Okay, so I'll leave you to figure out the rest of this. That probably seemed to Monroe and people like Monroe like to be a completely benevolent solution. Now, during Monroe's tenure as president, we already have the complete beginnings of what was to become the American Civil War. All right. Now that we have this expansionism going into what is going to become the frontier Midwest, right? This didn't have now under Monroe. It was actually to get worse afterwards, because after Monroe's presidency, you had the Mexican-American War, right? And the Mexican-American War really poured a lighter fluid on already what was the simmering coals of, are we going to have a country that was going to allow slavery or weren't going to? Right. So from a timing standpoint, the precursors were there during Monroe. But, you know, the Mexican-American War really set it aflame. I mean, we went into Mexico under the same sort of rationale that, you know, Jackson went into Florida, right? You know, to protect ourselves. But the whole thing had kind of a, I mean, if we do a history on General Grant, you know, General Grant actually was very lukewarm about the Mexican-American War. Not that he expressed those opinions, because after all, he was a professional soldier. but it had the smack of injustice about it, that we were invading another sovereign country because we could, and we defeated them because we could, and we took a considerable amount of land from them because we could. And that was just fine because, well, we're the Europeans and we have manifest destiny, and we're going to do something with this whole thing we just took from Mexico that the Mexicans they're not going to do it. We're going to do it, which is to create that society that I was telling you about before, that was going to be the envy of the world. That acquisition of land as a result, from Texas to California, right, up to like virtually Idaho, I guess it was, right? The second largest addition of landmass to the United States after Louisiana Purchase, right? So that created a situation where the South, the southern states represented in Congress, were going to force the Congress to make sure that all of the landmass under a certain latitude going all the way to California was going to be slaveholding, you see? Because if that landmass opened up as a free territory, then that means that the South would be eventually outnumbered in their representation in Congress, and there would be more free state legislatures than slave state legislatures, and they didn't want to lose their majority, because losing their majority, that is the southern states, would mean their own demise, because it was already very, very clear, even in Monroe's time, that the sentiments against slavery from the northern states was palpable. I mean, you had a religious, like a revival during this era, right? Right at the end of Monroe's time. And it was, this is literally immoral from a religious standpoint. And there was also, a big issue with temperance too, temperance and the morality of slavery. You see, so it was very, very clear to the southern states that the rest of the U.S. opened up as to be at least the majority of it freeholding states, then the South didn't stand a chance to continue on with their own lifestyle and their own way of living and their own economic system of allowing chattel slavery, having that be legal. You see, so that literally led to the Civil War. During Monroe's time, Monroe signed into law something called the Missouri Compromise, which is really emblematic of, this kind of kicking the can down the road approach about states that were territories first and then applied for admission to statehood in the Union of States of the United States of America. And so is Congress going to allow the states to allow slavery, or are they not going to allow these states to allow slavery? Right? And this is happening during Monroe's tenure. This is 1820, right? So the question is already there. And it's a flaw in our original documents, our original Constitution, right? Now, you could call this a flaw or not a flaw. I mean, the thing is with slavery, I mean, it was just like the biggest thorn in the side that ever existed for us, as far as administratively and everything else. The 10th Amendment to the Constitution, right? The last part of the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights being added to the original Constitution by the Federalists in the Federalist Papers, etc., to convince all of the original states to adopt the newly formed Constitution, right? Because the fear was, and you've heard me say this before, was that, all right, we're going to create a federal government, and everybody knows what happens when people, whoever they are, get hold of absolute power. they are going to become tyrannical. They're going to get drunk on their power. They're going to start deciding what's right and wrong, and they're going to be telling everybody else what to do and all of the sovereign states what to do. You see? And so the whole point of fighting the revolution in 1776 and the years afterwards was to free ourselves from that kind of monarchical power, that kind of authoritarian power, so that we can have what was traditionally referred to as our liberty, you see? So the Bill of Rights was added to say, look, here's the Constitution, and here's the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and these are here to guarantee the people who are skeptical that the United States Constitution will not be allowed to do two things. It will never be allowed to control the states beyond their will, and it will never be able to control the individual beyond their own will. See? It's guaranteed by the Bill of Rights. And that is how the Bill of Rights became ratified, you see. So the 10th Amendment to the Bill of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights says that anything that is not in the Constitution, written in the Constitution, as the responsibility of the federal government, automatically is the responsibility of the state. Now, the Constitution doesn't mention slavery, right? Other than the part about the representation in Congress, okay? There is nothing in the Constitution, the original Constitution, between the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, okay, that says anything about it, right? So that automatically means that the states are responsible for deciding if they want to be a slave state or a free state. So this is the first instance right here, 1820, where now the question is asked, well, we got this thing, is Missouri going to be a free state or is it going to be a slave state? And what about Maine, who was applying for admission at the same time? And the larger question becomes, well, who gives the Congress of the United States of America the authority to even make these decisions? It's not in the Constitution as being a responsibility of the federal government. So then why is Congress getting involved? You see, this is literally the beginning fundamental issues that lead to the Civil War right here during Monroe's time. See, so what they did in Congress was they came up with this compromise, hence the name Missouri Compromise, right? And the Missouri Compromise admits into the Union of the United States two states, Missouri and Maine, but it stipulates that Maine is going to be a free state and Missouri is going to be a slave state. You see? It also bans slavery from the remainder of the Louisiana Territory, north of the line 36 degrees, 30 minutes, right? So basically what you're doing is you're creating this horizontal line across the United States, which would have been continued, by the way, in the newly acquired Mexican territories after the Mexican-American War, right? So now by 1819, right, that's still during the first term of Monroe, both Missouri and Maine had sought admission to the Union at a time when states were divided equally between slave states and free states. You see, so like I was saying to you, the argument was in Congress. In Congress, the representatives of the southern states were getting very, very anxious about every single state that was going to admit it to the Union, because they didn't want the balance of power to fall out of their favor, you see? So the argument was really in Congress, right? So Northerners opposed the admission of Missouri as a slave state, fearing that it would open the door to other slave territories to join the Union, and obviously, and conversely, Southerners would not support any legislation banning slavery in Missouri and any other state or territory going forward. So this is literally, I mean, boom, the handwriting's on the wall about what's going to happen here, eventually leading up to, the election of 1860 and Abraham Lincoln, which is a total provocation for the Southern slaveholding states, right? And Lincoln says even before that, famously in one of his speeches, a country cannot remain like this, a house divided against itself cannot stand. So in other words, now it's we have to solve this. We have to settle this. You see, that was the other end of the bookend, right? But this end of the bookend, the beginning bookend, was things like the Missouri Compromise. You see, where it was kind of like, all right, well, what the hell are we going to do here? All right, well, you each get a lollipop. You see, that's literally what this was. And it was today we would call it kicking the can down the road. And that's exactly what it was. This didn't solve a damn thing. You see, well, you get to be slave state and you get to be a free state. Okay, let's go eat lunch. You see, I mean, obviously we were going to move to the rest of the, to the Pacific, and like I said to you, when the Mexican-American War occurred, okay, and we wound up with this vast territory, which was going to literally yield, right, what, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, obviously California. I don't know, I might be missing one. I think that's it, right? And now it's kind of like, whoa, all right, well, these things are all underneath this latitude, right? Because it's the Southwest, and the Southern states were like, that's all ours, baby. All of those, see all those states? Those are all slave states, right? And then boom, where that literally set the whole thing on fire, leading directly right up to the Civil War. And so, we'll do next time. I wanted to talk about, Andrew Jackson today, especially, and just, say how important he was as a figure. And it's fascinating also from the standpoint of that populism, and how Monroe allied himself with him. And because he was such a popular figure, it's kind of like, I'm not doing anything about him. It's like the people love him, and I agree with him anyway. You see, so Monroe doesn't get tarred and feathered with any of the stuff that Jackson did, but it all happened under the watch of President Monroe. It's just that it didn't stick to Monroe. Monroe in himself is, I don't mean this disparagingly, but he's a rather unremarkable figure. I mean, one of the things he's known for is this era of good feelings, just because it wasn't him that did it. And like I said to you, they were in this sweet spot after the War of 1812 and the beginning of the Civil War. And the opposing party, which would normally be tearing him to pieces, wasn't there to tear him to pieces. You see? It's fascinating stuff as far as politics is concerned. And of course, it all is politics. And of course, the legacy of Thomas Jefferson. For Jefferson, I mean, I can't say enough about this as far as Jefferson is concerned. Jefferson, obviously the original writer of the Declaration of Independence, right? And he's going to be the standard bearer of what the United States is going to aspire to be, at least from this aspirational sense. All men are created equal, right? Endowed by their creator, et cetera, and all the rest of that, right? One of the largest things to learn to understand the United States of America then and now, from its beginning right up to the present day, I've mentioned this to you before, is Jeffersonianism versus Hamiltonianism. You see, Jefferson felt absolutely that the only way the United States can survive as the republic as it was envisioned, right, based in having all of this freedom that individuals never had before, right? This was the first country where the average person, yes, albeit somebody who owned a piece of property who was a man and who was probably Protestant. Okay, that being, Jefferson felt as though the only way that you could remain with that much freedom and have the whole thing not go completely corrupt, okay, by people having the freedom, therefore corrupting that freedom to literally, in like this Machiavellian, evil, devilish sense, just like want to just be greedy and corrupt and take over everything and just screw everybody, was that we had to be this moral society, right? Which made more sense back in those days because typically, you know, people were living their lives, at least if not overtly, then even then perhaps privately, they had, you know, the Bible, which was a moral centerpiece of the way to live your life, right? But even more so, Jefferson felt like it would only work if power remained decentralized, right? That was Jefferson. It was the difference between Jefferson and Hamilton. Jefferson felt as though we were better off with an agrarian country where the power centers were never amassed in one gigantic place where everything across the entire country was going to be dictated by this insulated group of people in a geographically different location that has nothing in common with the people that it was creating rules and regulations over. You see, Jefferson felt very and deeply strongly about that. And he never wanted to see a situation where too much power was going to be amassed in what turned out to be Washington, D.C., right? But the handwriting was already on the wall before even Jefferson died. You know, Jefferson saw us, you know, it's kind of an interesting parallel. I mean, even if you want to look at it today, you have this things called like, you know, the, if you will, the, forgive the term, but the elite, educated, wealthy Californians and the people in New York and, you know, from the New England states down to the mid-Atlantic perhaps, right? With our education and our colleges and the money centers and the urban centers, et cetera. And that actually, you know, wagging the tail, I mean, wagging the dog, the tail wagging the dog of literally everything that you would refer to as a flyover country, state rather, right? A flyover state, right? You're not, there's nothing to go there. There's nothing to see there. There's just all of these people who are like Jeffersonians, you see? So you literally still have the vestige of the Jeffersonians in, you know, roughly putting the red states that are flyover states, who, you know, from the standpoint of profiling, not, this isn't perfect by any means, you know, kind of enjoy what Jefferson was referring to the purpose of this country, which was to provide liberty, you see? And Jefferson felt very, very strongly that if people became living too close together, or certainly the epitome of that would be in an urban setting or a cosmopolitan setting, that they would have to literally rely on each other, something today which we see as virtuous, okay, and ecologically sound. Jefferson saw that as unsustainable for the kind of democratic republic that he had envisioned the United States to be. You see, and so once again, for me personally, it's absolutely fascinating to look back at our early days, right? And say that literally, if you change the faces and you change the names and you change the technology, the sentiments and the people and what drives motivations are literally identical to right now. And in my opinion, and that's probably the most fascinating thing, not just for this course, but, you know, I've been teaching history for roughly 30 years. And it's the thing that strikes me the most. I'm around a lot of people who are like, oh, well, you know, that happened. They didn't even have cell phones then. How does that apply to me? You see? And I think that's foolish. But to you history lovers out there, I'm so glad that you've shared another session with me. I will go further into somebody I'm eager to talk about, who was a major player, as I mentioned to you, in the Monroe administration, one John Quincy Adams, right? And I think that you'll find that fascinating. And I want to thank you for joining me, and God bless you, and I will see you in 2 weeks. Thank you so much.
Thank you again, Art, for another wonderful session. Before we go, does anyone have any questions for Art? I didn't check the chat, but I don't think I saw anything. Oh, wait, hold on. Oh, okay. Nope, that's not a question. So if no one has any questions, thank you so much again, Art, for coming. Our next session will be Wednesday, May 3rd, and I will be sending out that Zoom link when I get closer to that date. This recording will be on YouTube. If you missed any of the other sessions, they're also on our YouTube page, and I will be sending this one out hopefully before the end of this week to have for you guys. All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and we'll see you all very soon.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Bye, Art.
So long.